vertical integration, oligarchy ownership, groomed bias, activism presented as journalism, and social media. These all impact your ability to learn what is happening in the world around you. Americans still widely believe that the media has a critical role to play in democracy, but at the same time, a growing number think the press is doing a poor job. To navigate the country's current roiling media waters, you need to understand the hazards that hover beneath its steaming, murky surface. I'm Allison Cardivold. Welcome to the first official episode of Just Saying. As I did the research for this podcast, I kept finding more and more things I wanted to talk about, so I'm going to divide this episode into two parts. The first will examine the impact of vertical integration, oligarchy ownership, and bias. Part 2 will look more at activism presented as journalism and the hazards of using social media as news content. You know the story about the boiled frog, right? It's the one where you put a frog in a pan of cool water on a stove, you turn on the stove and slowly heat the water. As the story goes, the frog doesn't jump out. In fact, he just sits there until he boils and he dies. There's nothing stopping the frog from hopping out. No lid. It just happens so slowly, he doesn't notice how dangerous it's getting until it's too late. Well, in this story, I am the not boiled, but scalded frog. I have spent my entire adult life working as a journalist. As a network news freelancer, I was a little frog, not just in a pan, but in a cauldron big enough to sustain its own ecosystem. An outsider free to swim from one network to the other and gain intimate insight into the inner workings of each lily pad, let's say. For decades, I defended the media against all comers, people I didn't even know, and sometimes family members and friends. Then several years ago, my edge of the cauldron tipped, and I was spilled out away from the heat. I did not jump out on my own, mind you. Circumstances were just such that at that point I needed to step back from my chosen profession and take care of my family. In doing so, I learned distance can provide its own insights. Now things on the home front are better, and I'm finally at a point where I could re-enter the workforce. To be honest though, I'm struggling. My cauldron, journalism, the media, that water is now at a full boil, and I don't know if I can bring myself to jump back in, at least where I was in the past. It's as if we are back in the late 1800s and William R. Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer are willing to start a real war just to sell more newspapers. Yellow journalism, it seems, was the original fake news. So for now, I've decided to set out atop my own little lily pad and do this podcast and website. It wasn't an easy decision because after this, the other big lily pads are likely not to have me back. And the waters are pretty turbulent for such a small platform. But enough about frogs and lily pads. Let's jump in and talk about the things that you, the average person, just trying to live your life, might not realize about what is lurking beneath the surface of America's news media. First up, consolidation. There was a court ruling, if you didn't know, that's going to open doors for what's called vertical integration. On June 12th, U.S. District Court Justice Richard Leon ruled on an antitrust case that the Department of Justice had brought against AT&T and Time Warner. This was the first time in decades the DOJ's antitrust unit had tried to stop companies from merging that were not direct competitors. The merger would, however, allow the two companies to achieve what's called vertical integration. Instead of just delivering content, AT&T would be in charge of creating content too. After 18 months of prep and a 6-week trial, the judge ruled in favor of allowing AT&T to buy Time Warner. As AT&T Time Warner attorney Daniel Petrocelli left the courthouse, he said, "As the evidence in the trial shows, this will only serve to benefit consumers, just as we have seen from all the other vertically integrated companies that are providing so many wonderful new offerings and innovations to consumers as they are watching television in so many new and different ways. And this is just an iteration of that process." Unquote. In contrast, Macon Delarim, Assistant Attorney General of the Antitrust Division, indicated that his department would be reviewing the ruling to determine the impact it might have on future mergers, but said that, quote, "it does not change our view that structural remedy is the best way to protect American consumers," unquote. While the DOJ does that, looks into things, media conglomerates are poised for the onset of merger mania. Disney and Comcast are already in a bidding war over parts of 21st Century Fox. Instead of breaking down who might buy what, I want to delve deeper into how media consolidations impact your ability to remain informed about the world around you. I want to talk about the impact they have on the news, not just media at large. However, if you have not been following all the vertical integrations that have and are likely now to continue to occur, instead of reinventing the wheel, I suggest you follow the video links I've placed on the episode's extra page in the corresponding article on the website, gistsaying.com, GISTSAYN.com. One of these videos is done by the Wall Street Journal, and the other was put together by NBC News. They are each about 3 minutes long, and I think the visuals will really help you understand the current media landscape and how it is bound to change rapidly in the coming months. Incidentally, the Wall Street Journal is owned by the same family-run dynasty that currently owns News Corporation or News Corp and 21st Century Fox, which also owns Fox News. And NBC News is owned by Comcast, another company where one family holds 33% of the company's voting power. In 2016, Forbes published a story entitled, "These 15 Billionaires Own America's News Media Companies." The list has continued to morph since then, but names like the former mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg of Bloomberg Media, Rupert Murdoch, who among other content providers owns Fox News, and Amazon's Jeff Bezos, who bought the Washington Post in 2013 and who, given the recent court ruling, may just be getting started with his media purchases, are all still valid examples of the billionaires in charge. So right about now, you might be wondering, why does this matter? Well, here are a couple of examples. In 2005, the Wall Street Journal was ranked by a UCLA study as being the most liberal of all the then 20 major media outlets that they surveyed. Today, it's unlikely you'd find anyone who describes the paper as liberal. The website Media Bias Fact Check ranks it as slightly right of center, due mainly to its editorial page content. So what changed? Ownership. In 2005, the paper was controlled by the Bancroft family. In 2007, they sold it to News Corp, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, who is widely viewed as conservative. Is that a coincidence? Not likely. Here's another example. Back in April, a video from Deadspin went viral that demonstrates the impact oligarchy and out-of-market ownership can have on local TV newscasts. It is a brutal visual example that local content is not always produced locally. If you haven't seen it, go to the website. It's there under the episode extras tabs. The video shows anchors in multiple markets all reading from the exact same script. In this case, the stations are owned by Sinclair, whose owners are the Smith family led by David Smith, and they're viewed as conservative. CNN and other national media news outlets quickly ran stories and headlines like, "Sinclair tells stations to air media-bashing promos," and the criticism goes viral. Sinclair fired back with another video, pointing out that CNN has also preached against fake news from its international platform and wonders aloud why what it did was any different. Unfortunately, there is more than enough hypocrisy to go around here. Yes, Sinclair currently owns 192 local stations and can influence control over what news stories are covered and how they are covered in 89 markets. However, while Nielsen ratings show CNN lost 25% of its primetime viewers in May, it still has the potential to reach 91 million U.S. households and 354 million households worldwide. CNN Digital continued to rank number 1 among all online news sources in May, with 128 million unique domestic visitors. In addition, it will soon be getting paid by Facebook to provide news content for its new Facebook Watch, which will further increase its reach to viewers and readers on that platform. So CNN anchors slammed Sinclair Broadcasting for exhibiting a conservative pro-Trump narrative across its virtual national platform. However, CNN's own rating on media bias fact check is left bias, and its factual reporting rating is mixed. The site's definition of left bias is, quote, "These media sources are moderately to strongly biased towards liberal causes through story selection and or political affiliation. They may utilize strong loaded words, wording that attempts to influence an audience by using appeal to emotion or stereotypes. They may publish misleading reports or omit reporting of information that may damage liberal causes," unquote. Whether or not you agree with this rating, this is not the CNN of Bernard Shaw's day. Not the one people watched as we went to war in Iraq and we watched that war unfold live in front of us. The problem is not just who has the greatest reach, it's bias. Don't get me wrong, there was bias 30 years ago, and companies looked out for their own best interests. But bias wasn't sanctioned. It was not groomed and rewarded the way it far too often is today. Bias was not expected. So on the lines of natural versus groomed bias, a June Gallup Knight Foundation poll indicated the public's belief that the information they receive from the news is biased has risen to 62%. 62% of the people think that the news they're getting from news outlets is biased. From social media, they say 80% biased. Everyone has biases. They are constantly being influenced by the lives that they live and the people and the events they see and interact with. Completely unbiased reporting is unattainable. But in my opinion, and as I was taught, we should still strive to achieve it. Newsrooms have always been susceptible to groupthink. You have a relatively small section of people working long hours under stressful circumstances, and often out of sheer exhaustion, they eventually stop sticking their heads up out of their foxholes. They talk amongst themselves, they socialize amongst themselves, and mistakenly believe that since they all agree with each other, everyone else must agree with them too. And if you do happen to be one of the few in a newsroom who has an opinion that varies, you learn pretty quickly to keep it to yourself. Referring back again to that June Gallup Knight Foundation poll, what is perhaps even more disturbing is the fact that 39% of Americans believe that the news they receive contains misinformation, and 44% feels it's inaccurate. Again, this is from traditional news media outlets. It's up in the 60s when you include social media. But what these seem to imply is a feeling out there that there is an intentional effort underway to mislead them. Are these journalists just overworked or inept? Are they acting on their own, or do their marching orders come from the top? In my experience, it can be any combination of these things. I do know, though, the further along in your career you are, the harder it is to stand up to orders you disagree with. My first job out of college was as the nightside weekend reporter at the ABC affiliate in Spokane, Washington. Call letters KXLY. On the weekends, I was always the first one into the newsroom. By design, I would answer phones, monitor scanners, log feed tapes, and figure out what my package story would be for our first newscast of the day, which would not be until 6:30 at night, by the way. At midday, the producer would arrive, take over the desk duties, and begin deciding what other stories would be in the show while I went out into the field with a cameraman to do my package and a couple shorter pieces to help fill the newscast. Unless a story was breaking, I would go home after my report aired on the 6:30 news. And the producer would stay on through the 11 p.m. news where my story would be rerun. I was 23 years old, inexperienced, righteous, passionate, and naive. I loved what I was doing. I thought it made our community a better place. I totally bought into the ideal that the press served a vital role of not only keeping its community informed, but keeping our democracy a democracy. I tell you all this because it explains my mindset on that Saturday morning so long ago. At least, I think it was a Saturday. Really, it could have been a Sunday. That morning, when I picked up the phone and heard a man identify himself as the owner of the McDonald's franchise in Spokane. The man was a bit upset, and he asked me if we planned on doing a story about protesters, vegetarian protesters who wanted to picket outside some of his restaurants. Now, this was the first I had heard of any kind of possible protest, and the weekends could be a bit slow as far as the news went, so he now had my full attention. I told him I was unaware of any protest, but rest assured, if anyone was picketing outside of his restaurants, we would be there to cover it. Keep in mind now, I was fresh out of college. In response, he about lost his mind. He was yelling something like, "I advertise heavily on your station, and I do not want you doing a story about protesters." I calmly explained that we didn't have any current plans to do a story, but if a large group gathered outside of a McDonald's restaurant and picketed in protest, I had an obligation to show up and see what was going on. Mr. McDonald's owner did not like that answer either. And he informed me that he would be calling my boss. I politely said he was free to call whomever he'd like. When the line went dead, I began calling around to all the McDonald's in town to see if anything was actually happening. Honestly, I was a little disappointed that no one I spoke to had seen any sign of protesters. But then the phone rang again. It wasn't my boss. It was my boss's boss's boss. I don't think I had even met the general manager / vice president of our corporation that owned our station at that point. But there he was, asking me why he had just received an irate phone call at home on the weekend from one of our station's biggest advertisers. I gave a recap of my previous phone conversation, at the end of which he said, "If I were in your moccasins, I would not do a story about a protest at McDonald's." I said I had no plans to do one, but that I didn't think it was right for any advertiser to try and dictate the content of our newscasts. You do remember what I said about being young, naive, and righteous, right? At this point, he simply repeated, "If I were in your moccasins, I would not do a story on this." The moccasin thing has always stuck with me. I then reiterated that advertisers could not be allowed to hold our newsroom hostage. As the phone call was winding down, the weekend sports anchor had come up to my desk and heard my side of the conversation. When I hung up, he asked with great concern who I had been talking to. Once I told him, he said, "This is not good, Allison. This is not good for you at all." At the time, I didn't understand really what he meant. But ultimately, he was right. It wasn't very good for me. And while he went on to work there for many years to come, I didn't last another year. But you live and learn. I tell you this because I want to show you that back in the early 90s, this type of interference from the bosses who were not involved in the day-to-day making of the news. You know, this guy wasn't the news director. He was in charge of the entire station, so the entertainment part as well. This type of interference remained pretty much at arm's length. It didn't play out in public, and it was usually driven by a desire to protect the company, not directly advocate to change what viewers thought about anything else. Or maybe it was only limited because the company's interests were limited. Things that make you go, I can tell you this. It certainly wasn't because the media was without liberal bias. If you Google media bias charts, you will see a subjective mix that shows which side of the line various organizations lie. One constant, though, is that there are more liberal than conservative outlets on all those charts. Since at least the 60s, newsrooms have been heavily weighted to the liberal side of the spectrum by individuals that work there. In 2005, a study done by UCLA adopted the same methods used to determine whether representatives or senators' voting records are liberal or conservative to determine the leanings of media outlets. The results surprised even the study's author. Tim Grosclose is a UCLA, or was a UCLA, political scientist and the study's lead author. And he said, quote, "I suspected that many media outlets would tilt to the left because surveys have always shown that reporters tend to vote more Democrat than Republican. But I was surprised at just how pronounced the distinctions are," unquote. Here's the thing. 50, 30, even 20 years ago, reporters were not allowed to give opinions, not on the air or in print. Opinions were the jobs of commentators and columnists. They stayed on the op-ed page or in the op-ed portion of the newscast. The definition of journalism was, and actually still is, to be accurate, fair, and objective. And it's that objectivity is an important piece we seem to have lost. Today, 66% of Americans say most news media do not do a good job of separating fact from opinion. According to a Gallup Knight Foundation survey released in January of this year, on a trust scale of 0 to 100, the American public gives the media a 37. A 37. Talk about a failing grade. And a failing grade, that is the cost of obliterating the line between fact and opinion. Because without it, you don't have objectivity. Without objectivity, you lose trust. And without trust, what good are you? Just gossip. Whenever you get a room full of people who all share the similar viewpoint, they naturally feed off of each other. Newsrooms are no exception. Opinions are fine. Everybody's got at least one. But they should not be disguised as fact. In its purest form, news is meant to inform, not tell you what to think. The sheer introduction of information can influence, so great care should be taken not to taint it. When bias is expected, unbiased reporting is no longer something to strive for. Instead, sellable personalities, gotcha storytelling, and corporate agendas win the day. The situation is hard to fight. For example, after Disney bought ABC in the mid-90s, its news programs slowly but surely started doing more stories about entertainment releases. Even producers at the network's flagship news organization, World News Tonight, began to be strongly encouraged to approve news angles for stories that could correlate with movies being released by its parent company. Back then, the corporate types called it synergy, right? Now it's vertical integration. I know firsthand that at least in the beginning, this did not go down well with the people actually producing the news. In May of 2001, I was asked to go and field produce a story in San Francisco about special police patrols being needed outside of movie theaters that were going to be showing Pearl Harbor. Remember that one? Ben Affleck. Love triangle, backdrop of the war. Well, apparently scores of death threats had been made against moviegoers of Japanese descent. So I went. Once I was on site and started to interview police, it became clear the story was bogus. One guy had sent all the emails. The police had talked to him, There was no real threat. And the only reason the police were doing patrols was because I was there with a camera crew. When I stopped rolling, so did the patrols. You have to understand, back then, the police actually wanted some media attention. The internet wasn't what it is now. People didn't have cell phones with cameras on them like now. It made me very unpopular with the entertainment reporter based out of LA, but I called the desk and I shared my concerns about the story not really being real. And they, rightly in my view, killed the story. Pearl Harbor did not get any free advertising during the news broadcast that night. But, and this is a big but, that is just one story on one day at the beginning of the onslaught of interference from distant parent companies, ones that were not involved in the daily making of the newscasts, broadcasts, or the stories printed. And this was during a period as they became more and more comfortable pushing corporate agendas into newsrooms and onto newscasts. As with any business where you're not in control, you either get on board with the mandates or you get pushed out. Then the new people hired are taught from the beginning what is expected of them. I know a lot of very good people who would like nothing more than to just do the work, report the outcome without picking a side. But they also want to keep their jobs. In television, keeping your job means having stories on the air. Getting stories on the air means covering ones that higher-ups want to see. So you can try and be as straight about it as you want, but if you don't play along some, you won't be there. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator. And a valid one in a lot of cases. But what is good for the part is not always good for the whole. Freedom of the press is not our First Amendment because our fledgling government wanted to make sure it could control every narrative. No, just the opposite. It is first because the Founding Fathers realized how easy it is to control people when you also control the information they receive. The power of manicured information is exactly why dictatorships and communist countries insist on controlling the flow of information and ideas. We Americans do not fully appreciate the purpose of our free press. But rest assured, if subverted, both individuals and the Republic suffer. So I'm going to stop here for now to keep the time at about 30 minutes. But if you're eager for more, just roll on into part 2, where I'll be talking about journalism versus activism and how social media impacts that equation. For now, thanks for joining this little scalded media frog. And please follow the website and the podcast both. You can also download the Podbean app. They don't pay me to say that. I pay them actually to host the podcast. But they do have a good mobile app for both Apple and Android-based products. And once we get a few more episodes uploaded, you'll also be able to follow us on iTunes if you like and some other platforms. Let me know what you think. As long as you keep it civil, comments and questions are always welcomed. And you can reach out on Twitter, Facebook, all the normal social outlets, as well as email if you just go to the website. This is Allison Cardival, and I will see you next time. And remember, it's okay to agree or disagree, because I'm just saying.